Welcome clients, welcome colleagues, welcome partners, welcome companies interested in Canada and looking to export. Welcome all to our Go Global IBT Online webinar. Today's subject is how to sell online in Canada. We are delighted to be here with you all. Before we actually start the webinar, and just while we wait for the last people to log on, a couple of words quickly on housekeeping rules for the webinar. So we've planned this to be about 45 minutes long, so you should be back at your desks within an hour. During the webinar, we're going to launch 3 polls. We'd really like it if you could click on your mouses and respond to our polls. We've also got a live Q&A at the end, and we would really like it if you could put in some questions that you have, any comments or questions. There's a chat box you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. Click the chat box, put your question in, we'll get back to it at the end of the webinar. And finally, I've got a little sort of party bag, a handout during the webinar, which you can download and click on, and is an infographic. Lastly, you know that this is this event will be recorded, and you will be receiving the slide deck and the recording in your email boxes by Friday, let's say, so you can, you really enjoyed it, you want to listen over the weekend, fine. Last but not least, this is a special call out, and please, a big favor, there's a very, very, very brief survey at the end. It's got like 7 questions, that's all. So if you could just get onto the survey and answer it, it helps us make sure that we're on track, on point for subjects that interest you and how you want to do webinars in the future and what interests you most. So there you go. Sit back, enjoy how to sell online in Canada. And so I'm going to start off, I guess, really by introductions. On my right is Ludovic, and I'm really delighted that Ludovic is joining us today. Ludovic Ortuno is the Chief Operating Officer. He's also a co-founder of CDEP, and they have offices in Montreal and Toronto. And it's a terrific organization. Now, Ludovic himself is responsible for all of the export development services at CDEP. And so, every year he's working with like 140 different companies looking to develop their businesses in Canada. So it's, all companies are looking to go into Canada. That's a great port of call, and you've got his email there. So he helps them with everything regarding regulations, understanding market reports and information, as well as all the business in-market partnering, the in-country matchmaking, finding distributors and in-market partners. So that's your go-to place for that. He is a dual Canadian and French national. He also speaks, he's fluent in French, English, Spanish, and all of that. So we're delighted to have Ludovic with us today. Speaking, my name is Susanna Hardy, and I'm Chief Content Officer for IBT Online. I've been with IBT since 2004, so a long time. And I guess my title as content officer also reflects the fact that content is becoming a big deal in the online world. So I am responsible at IBT for our own content, and also for helping clients with designing, thinking about, strategizing their content when they're looking at international markets. A quick word on IBT. IBT stands for International Business and Technologies. We've been around since 2002, and we're a US company. Well, I'm actually sitting in the UK office today, and we're 100% focused on providing online tools for international companies. So we build and manage corporate websites and social media campaigns for companies looking to go across different markets. And we're very, very proud as well to have been chosen by 18 different US states to run statewide programs to help their SMEs, their exporters. So with that, I'm going to turn to the agenda, today's agenda. Ludovic is going to run us through some of the main issues about Canadian business overview, sort of looking at the big picture side. And then I'm going to be talking about some of the online profiles and the buyer's journey and the takeaways. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ludovic to talk about the Canadian business overview. Ludovic?
Yes, hi, Susanna. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. Thank you for the introduction. And as you mentioned, we're based in Montreal with a satellite office in Toronto, and we cover Canada for 10 US states and also European region, helping their exporters succeed in Canada every year. We have more than 10-year experience, and we're a team of 12 based in Montreal and in Toronto. Moving on regarding Canada, just to get Canada situated a little bit, give you a few facts. We're 36 million, so roughly the population of California, but we're the second largest country in the world, so a very low density of population. The bulk of our people are living in Quebec and in Ontario, and 90% of our population is living within 100 miles of the US border. Which is really interesting given that we are the first trading partner with the US. We have two official languages in Canada, English and French at the federal level, and by provinces it changes a little bit. The only bilingual province, it's New Brunswick. Quebec is unilingual French, and the rest of Canada is all English on the provincial level. We have 10 provinces that are operating a little bit like U.S. states, so we are federalism, and we have 3 territories: Yukon, Northwest Territories, as well as Nunavut, that are a little bit more independent. Currently, the situation in Canada is very much linked to the fate of the U.S. in terms of the economic growth. We have 1.6 economic growth from year to year from last year. Employment is very low. It's 5.7. It's a low in 25 years for us. And we have also a very low inflation. Trade between Canada and the US is tremendous, as I mentioned. There's been more than 300% growth since NAFTA has been in place, and that's now ending to USMCA. There's an average of $2 billion per day exchange between the US and Canada. And right now, it's a time of changes with the USMCA. There's a lot of questions towards that from the US side, so exporters in Canada, but also from Canadian companies selling to the US and operating into the US. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Of course, Quebec and Ontario are the most diverse, in terms of sector in Canada, the diverse provinces, because they're the most populated. But regardless, Canada is still a little bit resource-based economy. When the price of oil is changing, our currency is also fluctuating on the market. Montreal, if I start east, we have the Atlantic provinces, the Maritimes, where there is a lot of know-how in the marine sector. We also have knowledge in the defense sector applied to the marine, marine products such as boats. There's a lot of construction of boats that is being done in the Atlantic provinces. A lot of food processing with product from the sea as well. When we look at Quebec, Quebec is really diverse. We are one of the first, hub in North America for video games and special effects. And it's also the third city in the world for aerospace after Seattle and Toulouse. Agri-food is also very strong. Mining is very strong. Northern Quebec, there is a lot of mining going on. There's a lot of trade shows in Canada that are good for mining as well. And it's a very good opportunity for auxiliary industries, so companies equipping those exploration companies. It's a very good segment of market in Quebec, as well as in Ontario, which is also a very good mining province. Ontario is really the manufacturing heart of Canada. There's more than 6,000 food manufacturers and food transformers just in the Greater Toronto area. Automotive is also very strong. Tier ones like Magna, Linamar are wrapped around OEMs such as Ford and Honda. There is also a little bit of automotive in Quebec, but it's really Ontario that is leading. Ottawa is great for anything that has to do with with the public institutions. When it comes down to defense, it's also everything is being done in Ottawa. And also Ottawa has a lot of space activity. So Ottawa is between Montreal and Toronto, 2 hours and a half from Montreal, 2 hours and 45 minutes from Toronto. There is direct flights, maybe 15 times per day at a low price between Montreal and Toronto. Otherwise, it's a 6-hour drive. When we look at IT, like I said, Quebec is very strong when it comes down to video game, but fintech is also growing as well, specifically in Ontario. And when it comes down to artificial intelligence, we have a very, very strong market and company base in Toronto, which is the financial head of Canada. Food is very important in Canada. 4% of the national GDP is food. There's a growing demand for healthier food choices and an increasing consumer interest for ethnic food options as a result of Canada's very diverse population. Food processors and restaurants are getting rid of artificial flavors, colors, and are mainly going natural. There is 2 trade shows that you need to keep in mind on the food sector. Is the CIAL in Montreal this year, and also the restaurant show happening in February in Toronto. You'll have a list of the trade shows that I'm mentioning at the end of this presentation. When it comes to medical health, IT, the United States accounts for half of the imports because of the advance in innovation that the US have towards Canada. That's one of the disadvantage of having a public health system, if there's any disadvantage to that. Cybersecurity is a major concern as well in Canada, so it's a very good growth market segment for US companies and exporters. Cloud computing is also a very good growth segment specifically in Quebec. And again, for any company that is working with Canadian Forces or Health Canada or any institution, really the focus is in Ottawa. It's another country, so when you want to deal with public institutions, it's better to have a partner prior to engage those institutions. I think we can move up to the next slide, please. And again. Yeah, so I just finished at this one. So the next region I'm going to be speaking about is Manitoba. If you can move again. All right. So Manitoba, and really I didn't speak yet of Western Canada. Just to give you an idea, Montreal from Vancouver, it's almost as far as Montreal to Paris in France. So Vancouver is really the hot spot in Western Canada, and it's its own economy on its own, almost. Very strong business corridor between Seattle and Vancouver. They have a little bit of aerospace, IT, medical devices, and the region that is in between, which are the 3 provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, they're rather resource-based. So there's a lot of mining and oil and gas exploration being done in Alberta. And the population of Alberta is the population of the greater Montreal. So it's not dense, but it concentrates a lot of the gas and oil activities. Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they're rather rural, and it's all about crop production. But Manitoba, that has been at the bottom of the growth in terms of its economy within Canada, right now it's expected to be amongst Canada's leaders within the next 2 years. And they have been just behind British Columbia in 2016, and right now they're almost equal. It's one of the strongest economic performers due to a healthy growth across key sectors, including manufacturing, construction, service industries. And Canada's manufacturing sector is benefiting from the strengthening U.S. economy and with the lower Canadian dollar as well. So it's a big boost to Canada's non-energy export, which also supports growth in the transportation and warehousing industries. So this growth, there's a lot of needs from mainly U.S. companies and outsiders. Why? Because Canada has not been investing a lot into ameliorating its production processes and manufacturing lines. So there's a need to identify new efficiencies and cost-effective solutions in manufacturing. And a good example in Manitoba is the heavy vehicle manufacturing industry is looking ways to increase demand for sustainable transportation with reduced emission and increased fuel efficiency to develop new alternative modes of propulsion. And the manufacturing lines in Canada and in Manitoba needs to be revamped. So any engineering company that is linked to production processes would do very well right now in Canada. Moving up to the next slide, please. All right, thank you. So challenges for exporters to Canada. The Canadian dollar is still weakening with the price of oil going down a little bit today. Well, our currency is going down, which makes us more competitive exporting our products and which makes your products more expensive in Canada. Right now, it's 133 to the dollar, so 1 US equal 133 Canadian dollars. You need to take that into account when adapting your prices to the market. The NAFTA negotiation is a little bit updated right now because we are still talking about the USMCA being put in place, but negotiations are still going on. What that means is that there is instability a little bit regarding trade, and we can see that with the tariffs that has been put in place for aluminium and steel that are now being taken off. There's also a wood dispute between Canada and the US. So yes, this is the biggest trade relationship one of the biggest trade relationship in the world, but it's still fluctuating a little bit. Right now, there is also other unilateral, bilateral trade agreements, such as the one with Europe, which is distracting a little bit Canada from the US to Europe. Really, one of the challenges that needs to be addressed right away from exporters that are trying to enter the Canadian market is dealing in French in Quebec, because Quebec is one of the biggest market in Canada. So that's really something you should work on and think about, given the fact that also French is one of the official language. Labeling in French is something very important for any food manufacturer or any other product. And since we are still another country, there is very, very stringent and different regulations and standards between Canada and the US. And I would say that half the time when we deal with SMEs that are looking to re-enter or reinforce their position into the Canadian market, we do an update of import regulation, certification, and standards. That's maybe half our job. The other half of our work is putting you in touch with the right distributor, the right partners, the right integrator, the right individual sometimes to penetrate the segment of market that is the most important for you. And when dealing with SMEs, we understand that we need to take steps one after the other. So we're always here to strategize with our clients and say, okay, these are the low-hanging fruit for you. And we're also very agile in trying to make you understand what are the best trade shows. And if you're already going to these trade shows, build B2B meetings around these trade shows to make it work well with you. That's how we partner with our clients. Another thing that we hear a lot from U.S. exporters specifically is that we're so close that there's a similarity myth. So always do your homework in terms of what you're allowed to be doing in Canada. Because if you sell for example, your machinery to Canada and you're going there to install it at the client's premises, you will need a working visa. and you will need to go through that process before going there, or you can be stopped at the border. So we can also give advices regarding that and point you in the direction of the right professionals, lawyers, etc. I think that's I covered pretty much my my part. So I will be waiting maybe for the trade shows. Well, thank you, Susanna. Those are the trade events that are coming up in Canada starting in December up until the near end of 2020. These are the most interesting ones across sectors. But if you need really to pinpoint the right event, sub-event, conference, convention regarding your own sectors or specialties, please let us know, and we will be happy to provide that information to you as well.
Ludovic, thank you so much. That was a great, big landscape worthy of Canada's huge size. I'm gonna launch actually the first poll. I'm gonna take this opportunity to launch the first poll. That way, I'd really like y'all to get on click your mouse and have a look at the poll. The poll is: are you already doing business in Canada? Are you already in Canada doing business? Are you online, offline, online and offline, or just thinking about it? And about 3/4 of you have voted so far. So I'm going to give you some feedback on the poll just while we wait for the last ones. It's very evenly split, actually. About 25% are in Canada but not online. 25% are online and offline. And almost all of you, with except a few people, are thinking about it. Thank you very much indeed. That was really interesting and will help us as we go forward and design some more of these webinars. So getting on to Canada Online, and how does Canada Online look like? What does it all look like? Starting on this is a screenshot of Hootsuite. We're very grateful to Hootsuite and We Are Social. They produce these things every year. So Canada, 37 million people, 33% of them, near 34%, 34 million, 91%, 34 million are online. That 91% online is one of the highest numbers anywhere in the world. So Canada is seriously plugged in. It's actually kind of interesting for me because 91, the other countries that have that level of internet engagement are tiny. They're like places like the UAE and Dubai. They have like 90%, 98% internet connectivity. In Canada is huge, and it's quite interesting to me how something as big as that can have that high level of internet penetration. Equally, nearly 70%, 25 million, are active social media users. We'll drill down into some of those numbers. Just looking at sort of the broad picture. So as I said, Canadians love the internet. There's a graph there in the middle that shows the differences between Canada and the US, and you can see that those two bar graphs, those two bar colors, the dark and the bright red, are very similar. So Canadians are very similar to how they access and the time spent and what they do on the web compared to Americans. But what interests me and interests people working on the web on this is that the detail is quite different. And this is something you'll see more and more in this presentation. There's a subtle difference in each case with the Canadian side. And that subtle change is important in order to really have a strong online presence in this market. One of the things I wanted also to mention is the top level domain name. That's the country code. In Canada, it's .ca for Canada. Now, a lot of Canadians use the .com, which you'll have throughout the USA. But there's a .com and there's a .ca. And it's very intriguing to see where they get used more. Canadians use a .com and they're happy to go on .com sites for general browsing, not very specific things. But as soon as it starts getting into an area that you need a bit more trust, whether it's your bank, online education, training, public sector, and e-commerce, you'll find that the .ca takes a major step forward. And again, that's something I'll be digging into that a bit more later. But just to highlight, for that buyer's journey that you need, that you go through as you reach out and get more clients and drive your sales in Canada, your buyer's journey, you'll need that trust that you need to build with your target prospects. It's all about reinforcing your local credentials. Now, next on our broad brush, Canada's sort of social media, again very similar to the United States in the big picture, but again differences in this. Canadian adoption of social media was slower than that of the US. That means that you're still seeing a lot of net positive growth rates. So as I said, about 25 million people out of the 33 million are online, but it's actually growing at about 8%, 9% a year. That's a high growth for a relatively mature market. And again, we'll drill down more into social media and how exporters can use social media. Quick word on e-commerce, and you'll see that Canada is, sort of, where are they? Up there at the sort of 30 billion level, sorry, but amongst the 10 largest e-commerce markets across the world. Canada was actually, again, very slow to sort of a sleeping giant of online retailing. It's weird given the high internet penetration rate, but I think really the Canadian retailers were a bit slow off the mark. Amazon came in and seriously forced their hands to invest, and was the traditional sort of, the disruptor in the room. And again, just like kind of social media, you're now getting very strong growth rates happening in e-commerce in Canada. E-commerce is growing at about 20-21%. Pretty good numbers for an affluent, sophisticated market. For that. It's interesting as well, cross-border shopping is very, very popular in Canada. There was a UPS study recently that said about 80% of shoppers in Canada have made an online purchase from an internet retailer. And e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce is nearly 30% of all Canadian e-commerce today. By the way these images occur is with an infographic. I've just taken some screenshots from an infographic. And if you go to the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see, or should be able to see, that there is something called Canada's Online Environment. It's in a PNG. It's in an infographic form. You should be able to click on that and grab it and save it. Always nice to come prepared with goodie bags for a party. So I thought I'd bring you all an infographic on Canada. If anyone can't get that off their screen, it's because of firewalls, let me know and I'll send it to you directly. So one last thing about the general perspective of Canada, online is the digital compliance. Digital compliance really, again, took a big step forward and then just sort of sat there not doing much. Canada introduced something called the Canadian anti-spam legislation early on, and that was, it applies to absolutely everybody, applies to people, not people, companies, and so on. But then it has really not changed that much. There's been a lot of consultations, discussions. The current government has put a few things in place, but no decisions have been taken. There's a lot of discussion about something that would resemble the European GDPR, that's General Data Protection Regulations. It's sort of the gold standard of this, and there's Canada's definitely looking at that as a model for introduction as of perhaps 2020, 2021. Personally, I would like them to. Personally, I think that it's time for this, more legislation on how people use data would be a good thing. It would help users, it would help Canadians feel more confident about how their data is being treated. There are signs now that Canadians are a bit reluctant to engage because of that worry. And that makes life a little bit trickier for online marketeers like ourselves. So with that, before we dive down into the Canadian buyer's journey, I'm going to launch poll number 2. Poll number 2. Whoa, what have I just done? Here we go. Sorry about that. Poll number 2. Here we go. Here we go. Poll number 2. Do you have localized websites for your export markets? Do you have localized websites for your export markets? Yes, for all of them. Thinking about them, just a few. You know, is that something that you're looking to do? Is it something that you've already done? And again, about half of you have voted so far. And I'd say it's interesting, this time it's quite evenly split all 3 ways. In fact, we're getting like pretty well a third, a third, a third. A third of you have websites for all of your main export markets, a third of you for only a few, and a third of you are thinking about it. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to scoot right on and talk about the Canadian buyer's journey. And first, I'm going to give you a lesson in what not to do. This is the example of Target, U.S. retailer Target, that came to the Canadian market and had a very difficult start when they first went on to the Canadian market. They first really launched in 2013, and you know, it's I think they had first a couple of difficulties. This, by the way, has now been seen as one of those test cases, that MBA students look at. In a nutshell, what happened was that they launched in 2013. They launched in a bricks and mortar only. They totally underestimated the size of the country, the logistic needs, the need also to put in place service and after-sales services, and it also just really disregarded Canada's cultural and linguistic diversity. Now, Canada's market is small, but it's spread over a territory that's much larger than the USA. And furthermore, Canada has very specific legislation and regulations like packaging and food tariffs. So Target was not able to serve the Canadian market from its American distribution networks. So they had all kinds of difficulties here. And then they did not really take into account local specific formats. They didn't even do Canadian dollar translations properly. There was no French language characters. They didn't put things in metric. They left them in imperial. So a lot of the issues about going international, you know, the do's and don'ts of that were seen in those first rollouts between 2013. By 2015, the company said, right, we're stopping this. And they took a $5.5 billion write-down of their bricks and mortar stores across Canada. Now, they did not open an e-commerce site in 2013, and this puzzled a lot of Canadians too. So in 2015, they launched a Canadian website. But this was actually not necessarily that good. This was just 5 months after they closed their last Canadian stores. But when Canadians visited target.ca, they did do it CA, that's that top level domain name, they were redirected to a subdomain called international.target.com, which was an international version of the e-commerce site. And but if you went to, you know, so the Canadians were like, put in with everybody else, put in with, you know, everybody, you know, there was nothing Canadian specific. The site was not localized and it was not translated. So there was an English language website. There was a welcome message in English for all Canadian shoppers. And it said, make it easy to shop from Canada. But if you chose a different language, nothing happened. It stayed on the English. So if you're French Canadian, it just stayed on English. The company was established outside Quebec, so it didn't violate the province's language laws, but it did mean that French Canadians were rather turned off by the whole thing. Details on the product available were absolutely non-existent. Most of the products looked like they were available, but in many ways you couldn't actually add it to the cart, you know, and then when you did, there were big shipping and duties. So you'd add something worth $12 to the cart, and then at checkout, you'd get a $20 cost for duties and taxes. And then you'd get another $15 shipping. So it was really, really expensive and off-putting. International orders and product returns were managed by something called Border Free, and there was no idea about how customer service was handled at all. So the whole experience of the Canadian website also turned sort of negative for the company. It was really a big disaster for them, and I think a really good example of what not to do and how to to ignore the differences between one country and another. If people are interested to learn more about this test case, I'm happy to direct them onto the sources and the Harvard Business Review, which has done it several times. Right, going on, from our point of view, a website and an online presence is about awareness, consideration, decision. That is the buyer's journey. And how do we get that buyer's journey in Canada? For us, it's via websites localized for the Canadian market and online marketing localized for Canada. That allows you to get found, to be understood, the consideration part, and to do business. So what do we talk about? What do we mean when we talk about website localization? How do you actually get a localized website? This particular webinar doesn't have time to go into all the details on that, but you can see that I've put on this slide the 10 criteria that we view as key for a localized website. Translation, like into French, would be one aspect of it, but it's just one. So the actual language is just one aspect or one criteria of localization. Correct content management systems, regulatory hosting, the registered domain name, all those are equally important if you want to have a strong localized website that will be found locally and recognized as a local strong website. There you go. So keep those in mind. And again, you will be getting a copy of this slide deck and can go through. And we have other webinars on this particular aspect as well. I wanted to get back to this point about the .ca. Again, it's like, the key to being found in Canada and to be recognized as caring and good in Canada. Therefore, you need to have a .ca rather than a .com. Or if you have a .com, you can point it and direct it towards Canada as well. So that's I think what's perhaps sometimes forgotten is that search engines are, in fact, the way they operate is they operate in a localized way. They are searcher-centric. So if I'm sitting in Manitoba and I go onto Google Canada, which is my default search engine, and I type in ball bearings or, earth diggers or where's the best restaurant in town, Google Canada will give me the answers that it thinks are most relevant to me sitting in Manitoba. And if your company's in Florida, it might not think that you are relevant to the person in Manitoba, even if you produce earth diggers, great restaurants, and ball bearings. So search engines are localized. Therefore, your website has to be localized. That's why I've put on this slide, think of Google as 192 different search engines. Each one is specific to a country or, for example, for Quebec, a region or province within Canada. So that's the key to getting found for that. Another key of that really is keywords. We'll get onto that in a second. I wanted to do a quick reminder as well about some of the differences between Canadian English and US English. Obviously, there's some things like sort of, spelling and vocabulary and things. But I think what's really interesting from my perspective and from the online perspective are the keywords that are different and some of the references. So the keywords that you use could be extremely different in Canada or the US. The keywords that are working well for you in your Pennsylvanian company for Pennsylvania may not be working well for you in the Maritime provinces. And you've got to figure out what keywords are used in the Maritime provinces if you're targeting that area as an export reference. Equally, the references, which are part of localization, have to be absolutely relevant. They have to be, you've got to have the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. You've got to have local testimonials, Canadian testimonials that speak to a Canadian audience rather than someone sitting in Texas. And remember that Canada is largely metric rather than imperial. So make sure that all of your main words, your references, are also reflecting on that. Just an example about some of the keywords. So when we're looking at keywords for companies for their websites, we'll sort of look and see, which ones are the most frequently used, and also which ones are the most competitive. Which ones will give you the best impact for you. And here's an example. I mean, if you're in the running business, then perhaps the word running shoe or sneakers or runners would be important for you. So you're going to make sure that you're using the right term. And in Canada, you're probably better off. 70% of the population Google runner or runners rather than sneakers in Canada. And in the USA, 96% of the population are asking for sneakers. So it's the same search engine in terms of Google, although one is google.com and one is google.ca. Same language, theoretically. Different keywords, therefore different ad campaigns. And that's one of the main areas that you have to focus on when you want to get found. So again, using the right, adjusting yourself for the local Google. Here we have, Canadian French versus French. There's a lot of differences on this. French in France and French in Quebec is more different than English in England and English in America. So, it's 21% of the population claim French as their mother tongue. And Ludovic is proof that, they do speak English as well, but they really prefer to search in French. So if you are looking, and if you know that Quebec is one of your core markets, then you may really want to think about driving forward and looking at a francophone or Quebecois French website. I've taken a screenshot here of a blog that we produced, and again, I would encourage you, if you want to look at French websites, blogs, please do so on our website. We talked a bit about getting found through the right search engine and keywords and so on. Being understood is absolutely key to building trust that you need in a buyer's journey. You need to have the right keywords and the right relevance, yes. You also need the right local language, but all of those other things, the digital recognition, like the domain names, the hosting, all of those things build trust. And that's the trust that you need for that buyer's journey. If someone's actually going to commit and buy or reach out and say, yes, could you please give me a quote on that, whatever it is, piece of machinery, agricultural thing, widget, you're going to, that person, that prospective buyer needs to be able to trust you and to trust that you know them enough in Canada. The relevancy thing comes again, as I mentioned earlier, obviously through currency, measurements, but also images. It's really terrific if you can get Canadian relevant images onto your website. And that's not an expensive thing. That is something that's easily done in today's smartphone world. Next time you're attending a Canadian trade show, next time you've got a Canadian visit to do, take some pictures, stick it on your website. It does wonders for your localization. Equally, testimonials. Finally, contacts and the ability to deliver and pay in the local currencies and the local market. A brief word just about social media, and really I think that social media in this sense, I mean, again, I don't have time in this particular webinar to go through it too much, but I want to just, with this one diagram, to illustrate how social media has really forced a paradigm shift in the way that companies interact with other customers, with other companies, with competitors, suppliers, and so on. You can't really escape them anymore. It is like the web, it is customer-centric. Just as I talked about Google being searcher-centric, social media is customer-centric or searcher-centric. And your job as head of sales and head of marketing is to influence some of those black arrows that go from customer to customer, or customer to competitor, or customer to supplier, and make sure that you're influencing them on a positive way. And that's the key really of social media and of online marketing, is to make sure that you are there when the customer wants you, when the customer is searching, that he finds you and that you are relevant for it. Canada-style social media, as I said, is similar to a lot of what's going on in the U.S., with Facebook leading the charge. Pinterest, Twitter, you're going to recognize all of these things, obviously. But what's interesting to me is the level of interaction that Canadians, individuals, have with businesses. 86% of Canadians say that they have interacted with businesses on social media. The vast majority of them adding things on Facebook, likes, dislikes, comments, whatever. So again, it's a society that is worth engaging with in social media, that reacts to it if you are putting the right stuff out there. So and certainly the cases that we have, and can show you some of that. Here we go. I guess this is going to be my cue for the very last poll. Do you actively use social media? Do you actively use social media in your businesses? And at the moment, some of you are thinking that, oh, suddenly I just got a whole bunch of people voting. Right. I'd say about 50% of you have voted, and the vast majority of you say yes, domestically, and in just a few of our export markets. So the big bulk of you are very active domestically, and in a few select export markets. There's a few of you who are not internationally, and there's a few of you who are in domestic and in all of your export markets. Well done, you. Very impressive. For the final bit, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the websites that we've looked at in terms of for Canada. But I would also say, please, I would invite you to browse our website, go along there and see. There's a lot of testimonials from companies and from managers of companies talking about the journey they've done online and what's happened there, and how what their choices that they made, and that's worth perhaps seeing, if those are choices that resonate with you. I wanted to talk about these two websites here, which are both websites. They're actually both from companies who really say they both chose the same. They both have a US, they're both US companies, and they said their biggest trading partners, or the biggest export markets, are Canada and Mexico. And so we built for them a Canadian website and a Mexican website. And both of them had in-market partners, either distributors or local agents, who they wanted to help. They wanted to say, look, these are our agents, they're in the market, we need to give them extra things. We need to give them something which is an effective sales tool that they could really reach out in the market to. How do we do that? So in both cases, the local distributors were able to then use these websites and push them out there and show them as good credibility in their local Canadian markets, and really prove to their local prospects, yes, this is a company that really cares about its Canadian market. They really want your business, to the point where they designed and built some Canadian websites for you. This is another company that I just wanted to go through in a tiny bit more detail. Again, it's a US company. In the end, they decided to go internationally, although they have a very specific product. They decided to go internationally through their website and in-market partners, again, a sort of a tandem approach. And in the end, we've built about eight websites for them in total, all of them obviously fully localized. And in Canada, they have a Canadian English website, since the vast bulk of their business, they really decided to focus on that. The vast bulk of their business was not in, was Quebec, was not in Quebec. I was not in the French speaking areas of Canada. So they decided, let's focus on the English ones. But then running test cases with social media, what we did was we were doing social media in Canada, targeting Canada and getting good responses for it. And then when we were doing social media in France, we were, pointing it at the Quebec audience as well. And, we were delighted when we started to get some very good responses out of the Quebec ones, even if they didn't have the French website to go with it. We thought that was quite interesting. But the French social media in Quebec responded very well and reacted extremely well to that. So that was just sort of an example of creating content for a company, pushing it out there and managing their online social media presence directly for the Canadian market for that. I think the key of all of this, and for anything that you do online, really, is the golden rule of anything in the internet, because it is so fluid, is to set clear goals, and then clear ways to measure those goals, and then to actually do the analysis of them and learn. And there are lots of different ways that you can do the analysis. It depends on the goal and how you've chosen things. But regular analysis of it and regular define, and you can have, various goals running at various times. You can say, I've got a trade show in 3 months' time. I want goals set for that. I want to increase my footfall by 20%. But I've got a long-term goal of brand awareness. How do you mix those two? And that's perfectly doable with social media and localized websites. So that's sort of, the key for our success with companies is measuring the success, defining goals, and learning from them, and continuously evolving and changing those, and modifying and improving all aspects of the online side. So finally, just the takeaways, and then I can see that we've got a lot of questions actually. And takeaways in brief, if there's nothing else, from my point of view, from our point of view, as an exporter, as a company that exports, the world is online. You know that. You know also that anyone looking at a new company, a new prospective supplier, will look online, but they will look in their local online environment. They will search for you on Google.Canada. And even if they're on Google.com, it'll be Canada specific. So a localized website allows you to get found and allows you to be understood, and therefore do business as you grow trust and confidence through the buyer's journey. Finally, then, some questions, and for Ludovic and for we're delighted to answer the questions. So I'm just going to sort of randomly pick some of them out. And the first one I've got actually is for Ludovic. Ludovic, the question I have here are about taxes. And the question is, hello, Ludovic, I hear there are differences between federal and provincial tax rates. How do the two combine, and is there an optimal way of dealing with them? So kind of a big question on that. Sorry, Ludovic?
Yes, sure. So there's two different taxes on sales. So sales tax, apart from income tax. So sales tax is first federal, so you have a 5% government sales tax that aggregate or not with the provincial sales tax. So for instance, in Alberta, there is no provincial sales tax. So anything being sold, apart from food and some other exceptions, and in food, it's not all food, you will have to pay 5% above the price of the good. Then in the rest of Canada, except Quebec, we call the aggregation the harmonized sales tax, which is a combination of the government, the federal sales tax, 5%, and the provincial one, and it goes with 13%. And in Quebec, you have the government sales tax, 5%, that adds up, that is adding to the provincial sales tax for a total of 15%. So except in Quebec, there is, it's all harmonized, and in Alberta there is none. But for the Quebec side, you will have to have a sales tax being given back to the province and also to the federal government, and the consumer will pay both.
It's quite a lot of tax. Thank you, Ludovic. Very very succinct. I'm just going to get I'm going to answer a question now by which actually several of you have asked, and it's really I'm summarizing, but what role should my Canadian distributor play on my website? Fantastic question. I think there's two things. One, do not give your domain name to your distributor. You can buy your own domain name. Giving your distributor the website is essentially allowing him your online real estate. And that's not a wise thing to do. That is a valuable asset. Do not just hand that over to a distributor. A distributor does have an active role to play on a website. He certainly, his contact details should be there. His views and opinions should definitely be considered. You should definitely get a testimonial video from him about how great he is. All those things can happen, but do not let him have the control of the website or build the website for you. That's just handing over your brand to someone outside your company, which is not a wise thing to do. The second point is really that, again, in social media, your distributor has a role to play, but he's not necessarily a trained expert in marketing, nor is he really out there to build your brand without reservation. So careful on allowing someone like a distributor control of your social media. For the same reason as you wouldn't want them control of your website, don't let them have control of your social media. Yes, they have a role to play in it. They can give ideas, they can give videos, with contact details and so on. But they are not necessarily the best person to drive your online business. I have another question for Ludovic. Labeling. Does everything have to be labeled in English and in French? Ludovic, that's one for you.
Yeah, so as far as we're concerned, Canada is a bilingual country, and you have to have French and English labeling and manuals. And it's very specific to all the industries, but it's even more stringent when it comes down to food labeling, because there's also the type of information for food that you need to advertise on the back of the product. So think French and English. Think about having a professional translator doing that, ideally based in Canada, ideally based in Quebec, that is also renowned for working with the food industry.
Thank you. That's perfect. I'll take a last question, which is, I think, an interesting one. It's not one I've had before, which is about geographic distance across Canada. Can one website stretch from British Columbia to the Maritimes? I think that's quite an interesting question. Yes, it can, because of the way Google works, it can. Obviously, if you know that 90% of your potential customers are in Saskatchewan, then you can pinpoint your website, your localized website to Saskatchewan. You can pinpoint to an individual city if you want. But if you say, well, I'm not sure where my clients are exactly, they're all along that long border from British Columbia to Maritime, they're somewhere along that, then we can do that for you. So either you can have an absolute sort of laser focus on a particular one city, one place, and the website's totally focused on one city, or you can stretch it out for the full length. So that's basically, as long as it's sort of Canada specific, you can stretch it throughout from the Maritimes to British Columbia. So that's pretty cool. Right, we've probably run slightly out of time. I do want to just remind you about the survey at the end of this webinar. It takes like 30 seconds to fill out, but I really appreciate it. And then it just remains for me to thank Ludovic so much for your participation, and thank you all for attending. That's great. Happy exporting. We look forward to seeing you on future Online Global, Go Global Online with IBT webinars. Thank you so much, and happy exporting, all of you. Bye-bye.